Here. Okay. Hi, everybody. We're going to talk about tariffs for the climate tonight. Should be interesting, I hope. I am Dana Nuccitelli, Research Coordinator for Citizens Climate Lobby, grassroots advocacy organization. I'm also an environmental scientist and a climate journalist, having written for The Guardian and Yale Climate Connections. So, I'm going to talk about a few things tonight. I'm going to do kind of just a brief general overview about what's happening with climate policies in the current Congress and what CCL is hoping to accomplish in the current Congress, or try to get some positive stuff advanced as best as we can. Then we're going to talk about carbon tariffs, what they are, and how they fit into the current political climates of this current Congress. So let's go to see what's latest in the current Congress. So, what's going on right now is the main thing that we're looking at is the Republicans in Congress are in charge. They've got the majority and they are working on the budget. Since they are in the majority, they can use the budget reconciliation process to control the budget using just a majority of votes. And so they can do it themselves. And the main thing they're trying to accomplish is to extend the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which were the tax cuts passed in 2017 that are on the verge of starting to expire. But doing so is going to cost somewhere north of $4.5 trillion dollars, even more than that if they decide to do some other tax cuts like reducing taxes on tips and Social Security and things like that. That could bring it up north of $6 trillion dollars. And they don't want to just add that money to the federal debt. And so they're looking for ways to pay for that. So one venue to pay for that is through repealing some of the Inflation Reduction Act's climate incentives, which are somewhere in the ballpark of $750 billion. So a significant chunk potentially of that pay for could come from the Inflation Reduction Act. That's mostly from the clean electricity tax credits, which are worth something like $320 billion over 10 years, and transportation tax credits, mostly EV tax credits, which are close to $200 billion over 10 years. But those tax credits, although they cost money, they yield even bigger benefits for the economy, which you can see in this chart on the right here, from a report from American Clean Power, where the kind of solid boxes are emissions cuts benefits, and then the hatched boxes are direct economic benefits. And so you can see the clean electricity tax credits for the power sector have really big emissions benefits, also significant economic benefits. The transportation, mainly EV tax credits, have decent emissions benefits and really big direct economic benefits. The building and other tax credits are kind of similar. And so overall, you get somewhere north of $2 trillion in benefits for less than $1 trillion in funds. And so it's like a 4-to-1 benefit to cost ratio. And so if you repeal these tax credits, then it comes at a pretty big cost overall. So this pie chart on the right, I put together from averaging a variety of modeling efforts to estimate the emissions cuts from different parts of the bill. And so you can see the big one, somewhere in the ballpark of half of the emissions cuts from the Inflation Reduction Act come from the clean electricity tax credits. So those are the most important thing in the Inflation Reduction Act, and also, as we saw from the last slide, the most expensive part of the Inflation Reduction Act. But that's the part that we want to make sure that we preserve because it's doing the real lion's share of the emissions cuts. And fortunately, the clean electricity tax credits have a pretty big support among a lot of Republicans in Congress. So we're hopeful that those will largely be preserved. But that's one big thing we're advocating for. The second biggest chunk are the electric vehicle tax credits. Those are going to be a little bit more difficult, but they are good for both the economy, for local jobs, and local revenue in districts where there are lots of EV manufacturing facilities. And they're also good for the climate. So we're going to hopefully see if we can preserve those, but that's going to be a tough one. And there's some other pieces in here. There's the fee on methane pollution, the first federal price on a climate pollutant, which is about 7% of the IRA's emissions cuts. That's probably not going to survive, unfortunately. Incentives for building electrification and efficiency is about 5% of the emissions cuts. There are tax credits and rebates to encourage people to make their homes more energy efficient and other buildings more energy efficient. We'll see if those survive or not. They're not a big chunk of revenue, but I think they have a bit of a target on their backs as well. There's 9% for natural climate solutions. Those are pretty significant emissions cuts from things like climate smart agriculture, planting more trees, stuff like that. And then carbon capture and storage is another 8% or so of the IRA's emissions cuts. And carbon capture and storage has got some pretty solid bipartisan support, so that'll probably survive. And on that sort of agriculture front, we've got some policies coming up this year. The Farm Bill was supposed to be renewed in 2023, and they kicked it to 2024, and they kicked it to 2025. So maybe it'll get renewed this year. We'll see. But that's a potential venue to pass some climate policies, potentially related to forestry. So we'll see if we can do something there. There's also a bill going through Congress right now called the Fix Our Forests Act that Citizens Climate Lobby is supporting to help expedite wildfire management practices. Because right now, it can often take a really long time to get a wildfire management plan into practice because of delays through litigation and things like that and permitting. And the problem is that, if you'd have to take many years to actually for a wildfire management plan to come to fruition, that's many years of wildfire seasons that are getting really, really dangerous and explosive in places like California. And so that's not a good thing if you can't, like, if you have like a million acres burning in a given wildfire season, and those are acres that could have been treated and helped minimize that acreage that's burning. And so Fix Our Forest Act does some of that. It does a variety of different things to minimize wildfire threats. And so that has passed the House with some bipartisan support. A lot of California Democrats voted for it. And now it's in the Senate, which they're working on a version in the Senate that's hopefully going to get some bipartisan support there. I think the Democrats are asking to make some tweaks to make it a little bit more favorable to them. And then we'll see what comes out of there. And hopefully we can get a good bill to pass there. And then we're going to hopefully see some other forestry bills. There's one called the Trillion Trees Act that Republicans introduced in 2021. That wasn't that great, but then there was like a bipartisan version of that a couple of House offices were working on and just never got to the finish line and got introduced. So we're hoping we can get something like that, which is basically a way to plant a lot more trees because we have some aging forests in the United States that could really benefit from a lot of reforestation. So hopefully we can see something like that this year too. And then permitting reform is a really important area that we're working on at Citizens Climate Lobby. We almost got a permitting reform bill passed at the end of the last Congress, but it didn't quite get across the finish line because they couldn't quite get to a bipartisan agreement on that. But it's really important because we've got a whole lot of solar and battery and wind energy that's just kind of waiting to get connected to the grid, and we need to build that much more expediently so that we can both meet our growing power demand needs with clean sources and also replace some fossil fuel energy that's still on the grid that we really need to retire. And so we are hoping to get some permitting reform legislation passed at some point. Congress is pretty focused right now on the budget and all the other things that are going on. So it's probably going to take a little while, but at some point, hopefully, it'll return to some bipartisan permitting reform negotiations, and then hopefully we can get a good bill introduced and passed at some point to help us build that clean energy faster. And then we're going to get to sort of the topic of tonight's event, which is related to pricing carbon pollution, which has the potential, it's like putting a price on carbon pollution would be the single largest emissions reduction policy of any single climate policy, because it gets straight to the source of the problem, which is the climate pollution and it can hit every sector of the economy all at once just by putting the price on that climate pollutant in every different sector, as opposed to going piece by piece, like an EV tax credit and a manufacturing tax credit and all these other clean energy tax credit. Like you just hit them all at once with a price on climate pollution and make the polluters pay a fee for the carbon pollution that will result from burning the fossil fuels that they sell. So we would love to see that, but it's a challenging thing. And so let's talk about carbon tariffs, which is kind of where carbon pricing might come into play in the current session of Congress. Putting a price on domestic carbon in the United States and elsewhere is kind of falling out of favor right now. We actually just saw Canada. They have, or they had, a great carbon pricing policy in place where they put a price on carbon and they take the revenue that's generated and they send it back to households in the form of rebate checks. And that's kind of the ideal way to create a carbon pricing policy, the kind of policy that Citizens Climate Lobby supports. And we were very happy with Canada's carbon pricing system. And our Canadian members were pretty instrumental in helping it come to fruition. And then Mark Carney just replaced Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, and he decided to scrap that system, and he set the carbon price to zero for now until Parliament can retract it, basically because it became politically unpopular. The opposition party ran an Axe the Tax campaign that was pretty successful because we have inflation, we have high cost of living, prices are up, and people don't like the idea of paying taxes in general. And so it just became unpopular, and the Liberal Party decided that they had to exit on their own in order to have success in the next election. So that's the kind of political environment we're living in right now. Domestic carbon pricing is not viewed very favorably right now. However, Europe, they have a carbon price in place. They have an emissions trading system with a price on climate pollution, and they're implementing in the next year or so a carbon border adjustment, which we'll talk about what that is here in a minute. But that's very relevant to what's going to happen here. We also have President Trump, who loves tariffs in general, as everybody has seen. And if you were to put a tariff on carbon pollution, that would generate revenue, which is something that's very useful given the current budget negotiations, given that it's a goal of President Trump's. And it would also help to reduce climate pollution. And so that's why it's kind of an interesting thing to consider right now. And we'll talk about the details here. And so I want to make sure I'm not coming off as advocating for tariffs in general. So there are a variety of reasons why you might put a tariff on something. You can, for example, say we want to put a tariff on imports because we want to bring the manufacturing of that product back into the United States so that we're not just buying stuff from other countries, we're making it here. And so you put a price on the imports to make them more expensive to encourage people to manufacture that stuff in the United States instead. You can do it because you want to generate revenue. And so you put a price on the imports, and that money will come to the federal treasury, and then you can use it to pay for other things like cutting other taxes or extending tax cuts, for example. You could also use it as a bargaining chip, as we've seen happening quite a bit, and say we're going to put a tariff on your stuff unless you give us something that we want, and use it to persuade other countries that way. You can also do it if you want to level an uneven playing field. For example, if another country is largely subsidizing an industry in their country and then exporting that artificially cheap product into your country, that's might be unfair to your domestic industries, and so you might put a price or put a tariff on those products just so that your domestic industries are not at an unfair advantage in that situation. And another good reason to do it, reason to do a carbon tariff is if you just want to encourage the reduction of climate pollution. So those first three are kind of the reasons that we've heard why we're seeing a lot of the current tariffs on places like Canada and Mexico and China and places like that, and potentially Europe. I want to note that I'm not supporting those tariffs or those reasons in general. Those first three are actually contradictory because if you're going to do a tariff to bring manufacturing home. That's not going to generate revenue because if companies are moving their manufacturing into the United States, then they're not going to be paying the tariff, and so it's not going to generate revenue. Or if you're going to use it as a bargaining chip to get other things you want and like turn the tariffs off and on and off and on, as we have been seeing, then they're not going to be in place long term. They're not going to bring manufacturing because other companies in other countries are going to say, well, that tariff is not going to be in place, so it's not going to give me the incentive to move my manufacturing into the United States. And if the tariff is not in place for long term, it's not going to generate revenue. And so these three reasons are rather contradictory. And so, I'm not personally a fan of those tariffs, but there are good reasons to potentially justify tariffs, like potentially leveling the playing field. That can be a good reason, or reducing climate pollution is potentially a good reason to do a tariff. So, just important to distinguish between the kind of somewhat crazy tariffs we've been seeing and actually like tariffs that could potentially have some good potential reasons. So, one issue and one reason why we're considering this kind of carbon tariff situation is that in our current situation in the United States, we don't have carbon pricing. We do have environmental regulations that add costs to domestic manufacturing in order to comply with those regulations. And so if you're then competing with manufacturing in another country that doesn't have similar environmental regulations, that can put your domestic manufacturing at that kind of disadvantage that I was talking about. It can also potentially cause carbon leakage, which is where instead of doing low carbon manufacturing in your country, a company will export their manufacturing to one of those other countries with lower regulations. And so then the manufacturing will be higher carbon. And then we call that carbon leakage because the carbon is just leaking over to another country. You're kind of exporting your carbon emissions to another country because that's where the manufacturing goes. And so you don't want to do that because that's just creating more overall global carbon pollution. Many U.S. industries are cleaner, but as I mentioned, in order to comply with those regulations, their products are more expensive. And so that's because even though we don't have that carbon price in the United States, we do have pretty strong environmental regulations. We also have efficient and advanced manufacturing, but that also costs more money. And we have relatively clean power generation, which helps bring our domestic carbon content in stuff made in the United States down. And so, despite not having a carbon price, we do have lower carbon products, but complying with those environmental regulations and doing this efficient advanced manufacturing tends to add costs, and so we tend to manufacture more expensive stuff than cheaper and dirtier competition in some other countries. So a good example I like to point to of this is steel, because you can make steel basically two different ways. The low carbon cleaner way to do it is to take scrap steel and then melt it down in an electric arc furnace and make new steel out of that. Since it's an electric furnace, it's relatively low carbon. So this is how we make 2/3 of steel or so in the United States, but it's how only about 30% of steel is made globally. The other way to make steel is use coal-derived coke to melt iron ore and to make what we call virgin steel. So that because you're using this coal-derived coke is a much higher carbon way of making steel, but that's the way that 70% of steel is made globally. So ideally, if you're going to be in the market for some steel, you would want to first try to buy the steel from electric arc furnaces, which tends to be like the kind of steel that United States tends to make. In the future, like we could replace that coal with something like green hydrogen and make that other way of making virgin steel cleaner, but it would help to have some kind of motivating factor to make that happen, like putting a price on the carbon content of that stuff. And so that's kind of one way that a carbon tariff comes into play. And so overall, this chart is from the Climate Leadership Council looking at the carbon intensity of a variety of products. You can see on the left here from the United States compared to those in other countries, a variety of other countries. And if it's red and greater than one, it means that that product in that country is higher carbon intensity than American stuff. And if it's blue and lower than one, it means it's lower carbon intensity than American stuff. So you can see the United States is, again, relatively low carbon, comparable to some other countries like Canada and Europe, but lower carbon than some of our competitors like China and Russia, for example, and lower than the rest of the world on average. We had a similar study from the Niskanen Center. Again, very similar. If it's red and greater than one, it means that product is higher carbon intensity from that country than the United States. If it's green and less than one, it means that they're lower carbon intensity than the American equivalent. So you can see we're similar to Canada, Mexico, and South Korea. We tend to be actually higher carbon than the UK and the EU and maybe Japan, but we are lower carbon intensity on average than China and Russia and places like that in the rest of the world. So also, if you are concerned about, geopolitical issues associated with places like China and Russia, as many members of Congress are, then, you might not want to be relying on them too much for your imports. And so, again, putting a price on this extra carbon content of their stuff can sort of help lessen your reliance on imports from those kinds of countries. And so that's kind of another potential reason to want to put a price on or a tariff on carbon pollution. So, as we kind of saw in those from those studies, American products on average are about 40% less carbon intensive than the global average. And right now, we're importing about three-quarters of our stuff from less carbon efficient countries, largely places like China. And so, if you were to put a carbon border adjustment or a carbon tariff on our imports, then that would allow American industries to leverage that carbon advantage that they have and outcompete that foreign production and be less reliant on those imports. So I've been using a couple of terms here that I should define. So a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a CBAM, is a way to adjust for the difference between domestic carbon prices and foreign carbon prices. It's not so relevant in the United States because we don't have a domestic carbon price, but it's more applicable to places like Europe and the United Kingdom who do have carbon prices. And so what they're doing is they're saying we have a carbon price of X dollars per ton. We're importing stuff from another country that doesn't have a carbon price. So as that product comes across our border, we're going to implement a price to make them pay. So we're adjusting as a product comes across the border to make sure they're paying the same carbon price that our domestic industries are paying. And potentially, when you export a product from your domestic industries to another country without a carbon price, you could potentially refund the carbon price on those exports again to level the playing field so that everybody is paying the same amount of carbon pricing. So that's a carbon border adjustment, and then there's a carbon tariff, which is more applicable to the United States because, again, we don't have that domestic carbon price. But with a carbon tariff, you can just look at the carbon content of the stuff being made by your domestic industries compared to industries in other countries, and basically put a price on the extra carbon content of the stuff being imported from higher carbon intensity countries. So if you do one of those things, the Climate Leadership Council did a nice report on this, and they concluded that an ambitious U.S. policy to price emissions, including a CBAM, carbon border adjustments, also a carbon tariff would have a similar effect, would turn the existing U.S. carbon advantage into a competitive advantage in the marketplace. No other policy exists to unilaterally improve the competitive position of U.S. firms, reduce domestic carbon emissions, and encourage global emissions reductions because nobody's going to want to pay that carbon tariff to the United States. They're going to want to reduce their carbon intensity so that they don't have to pay that carbon price when they export their stuff to the United States. And also it gives the domestic manufacturers the incentive to reduce their emissions so that they're making their competitors pay a larger extra carbon intensity price for their exports to the United States. We at this on the CCL research team had a research intern, Liam here, who did a really nice paper looking at the effects of these sorts of carbon border adjustments or tariffs. And he found that pricing carbon on imports will slightly boost domestic industries and gross domestic product because you're encouraging the people to purchase more stuff that's made in your country. It encourages investment in energy efficiency and clean energy technologies because, again, companies are trying to lower their carbon intensity of their products so they have more of an advantage over their foreign competition. It incentivizes further carbon standards for similar reasons. It's modestly effective at reducing that carbon leakage I talked about, where you're not going to want to export your manufacturing to another country if then when you export your stuff to the United States, then you have to pay that carbon tariff. So it's pretty good at reducing that carbon leakage. One downside is that a carbon tariff or a carbon border adjustment can adversely affect developing economies because poorer countries tend to have higher carbon intensity in their manufacturing, for example, because they have higher carbon electricity generation. And so that's something that you might want to watch out for, that you're not penalizing developing countries. And so we'll see in the coming slides some ways to do that. So there's been a few carbon border adjustment and carbon tariff bills introduced in the United States. The first one was called the Fair, Affordable, Innovative, and Resilient Transition and Competition Act, which I'm just going to call the FAIR Act, introduced in 2021 by Senator Coons and Representative Peters. And so this was an interesting first take on this. Basically, they said, well, in the United States, we don't have a carbon price, but we do have these environmental and climate regulations, and complying with those regulations costs money. So let's estimate how much money that costs, and then put a tariff of that size on imports from other countries that don't have equivalent environmental and climate regulations. So it's like if you're like in China and you don't have to comply with these same environmental and climate regulations, so you're making stuff more cheaply and it's dirtier, let's make you pay for that cost difference. This is kind of the first effort to gauge Republican interest in carbon border adjustments or carbon tariffs. They haven't reintroduced it. They're not planning to reintroduce it because there have been some subsequent bills in this area, but this is kind of a first stab at it, a kind of a trial balloon to see what would happen if they introduced this. And so the next one that was introduced was called the Clean Competition Act by Senator Whitehouse with a few other senators, and also reintroduced that was in June 22 and reintroduced in December of 2023. Plus, there was a House version that included Congressman Ami Bera from the Sacramento area as one of the co-sponsors. And so this was a CBAM, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, because it would have applied a domestic carbon price and then basically calculated the difference between our domestic carbon price and content versus foreign carbon price and carbon content, and then done a carbon border adjustment to adjust for those differences. But having a domestic carbon price embedded in the bill, it didn't get any Republican support. But then in November of 2023, a couple of Republican senators, Bill Cassidy from Louisiana and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina, introduced their bill called the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which is a carbon tariff bill that we'll talk about here. But basically, it looked at the carbon intensity difference of a variety of American industries on average versus their equivalent in other countries, and then it would have put a price on the extra carbon content of imports from other countries on those products if they exceeded the carbon content of the American equivalent. Interestingly, they kind of connected the importance of permitting reform to their bill. They say it's a complementary piece to the foreign pollution fee, because if you put this fee on these high carbon imports and you encourage people to buy low carbon American stuff instead, then you're going to want to manufacture more low carbon American stuff, but then you actually have to build the facilities to produce that low carbon American stuff. And so that means you should do permitting reform to let us build stuff faster so that you can manufacture more clean stuff and supply it to the world. And so, in order to actually capitalize on this carbon tariff and the encouragement of lower carbon domestic manufacturing, we should also do permitting reform to make it easier for us to expedite the building and manufacturing of that low carbon stuff. So that was an interesting connection between these two topics of permitting reform that I talked about earlier and carbon tariffs. So these three bills, they only cover certain industries. You can see the top here is the Foreign Pollution Fee, and then the Clean Competition Act and the FAIR Act. And so, for example, they tend to cover, like, these are sort of relatively high carbon industries that are traded globally. So like aluminum, there's a lot of manufacturing and trade, cement, some fossil fuels, hydrogen, petrochemicals, pulp and paper, things like that. And then some of them covered some other industries and some of them didn't. So they kind of picked and chose which industries they wanted to cover. And then the foreign pollution fee is on the verge of being reintroduced in the current Congress. From what we're hearing, they might pare down some of the number of industries that are being covered because they want to make sure that the domestic industry wants to be covered. Because they don't want opposition to the bill from domestic industries, and so that's going to kind of pare down these categories a little bit, I think. So let's compare a few important aspects from these bills, like what's the carbon price is an important one. And so in the Clean Competition Act, because it had a domestic carbon price in there, that domestic carbon price that is set at $55 per ton of carbon dioxide, rising at 5% per year plus inflation, and applied that both to domestic and to imports. The FAIR Act just tried to, it basically asked federal agencies to estimate the cost to comply with domestic regulations designed to limit climate pollution in each sector and come up with that cost and then apply that to imports. The Foreign Pollution Fee Act is interesting because they don't want to set a price on carbon, and so they do what's called an ad valorem price, which is where you apply an extra price that's proportional to the value of the product. So you say, a value of or the price of a ton of aluminum is X, and then we're going to add like 15% to that or something. And then that is the extra fee that you have to pay on imports if your aluminum from your imports is higher than the aluminum from American manufacturers, for example. So it's a little bit complicated. They're trying to simplify it a little bit in the version being introduced in this session of Congress. So we'll have to see what they come up with there. But that's kind of the general idea, is just to add a percentage to the value of the product. And then does it impose a domestic carbon price? The Foreign Pollution Fee Act very much doesn't. In fact, it specifically says that nothing in the act shall be construed to authorize the creation of any carbon tax or fee or pricing or anything like that. So they're being very careful because they want this to appeal to Republicans to say, no, it's not a carbon price domestically. The Clean Competition Act, yes, does apply that domestic carbon price at $55 per ton. It also refunds it if you're exporting a product from the United States to another country that does not have a carbon price. That's their carbon border adjustment so that everybody's on the equal playing field. And the Fair Act only put that price of complying with environmental and climate regulations on imports from other countries that don't have equivalent regulations. And there's a question of what you do with the revenue, because you're putting this price on imports, then that money is collected by the government from stuff that's being imported into the United States, and then what do you do with that money? So the Clean Competition Act just said we'll take 3/4 of that and put it in a grant program to help U.S. companies decarbonize. And then the other quarter will do a program to help developing countries decarbonize. The FAIR Act said we'll take half of it and put it in a Resilient Communities grant program. The other half we'll give to research in emissions reductions technologies. The Foreign Pollution Fee Act so far doesn't specify what it's going to do with the money, which basically means it just goes into the Treasury, which means that potentially you could take that money and use it as a to pay for other things, like, for example, if you're trying to pay for extensions of some tax cuts. You can say, okay, we're going to use this foreign pollution fee to pay for some of those tax cuts, and so maybe you wouldn't have to take the money from somewhere else, which would be nice. So that's kind of an interesting wrinkle there. And then there are some potential exemptions. So the Clean Competition Act exempts relatively least developed nations and countries with carbon prices similar to those that it would impose. So again, this gets to the point that you don't ideally want to penalize developing countries. And so basically this says, if you're a developing country, you have high carbon content in your manufacturing, we don't want to penalize you because you are a poor country, and so we will generally exempt you. The FAIR Act is very similar. It exempts least developed countries and also countries that have similar laws and regulations or that aren't imposing a CBAM on us. So it's pretty limited on who it actually applies to. And the Foreign Pollution Fee Act is, again, kind of similar. It says if you're in a free trade agreement with the United States, then you can get some forgiveness, or if you are a country that we make a partnership with, which is intended especially for low-income countries. Again, trying not to penalize low-income countries. for having relatively high carbon intensity manufacturing. You say, we'll make a partnership with you that will exempt you or at least give you some forgiveness, and so you don't face as large of a penalty or a price on your imports. So it's nice that every one of these bills is looking for some way not to hurt the economies of developing countries. I appreciate that. So those are the bills that we're looking at related to carbon tariffs and CBAMs. And so what's next in Congress is that the foreign pollution fee we expect to be reintroduced probably pretty soon. If it happens soon enough, it could be included in the budget reconciliation process that we're seeing among congressional Republicans to raise some revenue and to basically use as a pay for some of those tax cut extensions. But time is running short here because they're already working on the legislative text for their budget reconciliation. So it kind of depends on how quickly the bill can be introduced and considered by all members of Congress, well, especially Republicans, because they're the ones working on the budget reconciliation, and how congressional Republicans feel about that. And so we'll have to see if that can happen quickly enough and get enough support among congressional Republicans to be included in the budget reconciliation process. Another option is that it could just be a standalone bill, in which case it would have to it would have to be subject to the filibuster in the Senate, and so it would have to be bipartisan, would have to have at least seven Senate Democrats vote for it. So that would require some compromise between the parties because you would have to have both Republicans and Democrats having some support for the bill. Again, we have seen carbon tariff and border adjustment bills introduced by both Republicans and Democrats, so that is a possibility. It would just depend if they could kind of agree on some legislative text that would be beneficial in the eyes of both parties. And there are a variety of ways that they would see it as beneficial. Democrats would like to see the carbon benefits of encouraging lower carbon intensity manufacturing. I think Republicans would like to see holding countries like China to account for their relatively dirty manufacturing and trying to reduce their advantage there. And there's the geopolitics associated with China and Russia, and so it's got potential that there could be a bipartisan compromise there, I think. Also, Europe is moving forward with their CBAM. Their CBAM is supposed to be introduced in 2026 next year. The UK is supposed to introduce a CBAM in 2027. So those are coming. And so if we want to have something equivalent, then we're going to have to get moving on this. Otherwise, we're just going to have to be subject to Europe's CBAM, and that's that. And we're not going to have an equivalent here. So there's some time pressure there to get something going so that's we're not behind the ball there. And so the current political climate is pretty favorable to the concept of a carbon tariff because Republicans are looking for a lot of pay-fors for that 4.5 plus trillion dollars of their tax cut extension bill. Um, President Trump is very amenable to tariffs in general, as we've seen. So I mean, if you're going to do tariffs, let's at least do tariffs for a good reason, and put some tariffs on some carbon pollution and reduce some climate pollution. So that would be nice. So there's definitely the potential for it. It just depends on kind of the nitty-gritty details, whether Republicans can get on board with Senator Cassidy's bill, whether it becomes bipartisan, whether it comes in time to get included in the budget bill. So we'll see, but there is definitely some potential for a carbon tariff bill to come this year and to be included this year. So it just depends on whether the stars align and allow that to happen. So I'll stop there. Here's my information. There's my email. And I'm on, of course, the Citizens Climate Lobby community forums. If you want to come join us there, citizensclimatelobby.org. We've, of course, got our CCL Sacramento chapter that we welcome new faces, of course. And if anybody has any questions, let's see. We have a Q&A box, which there are any questions there, which I should have suggested. If you guys have questions, pop them into the Q&A box. But I can probably just allow people to talk to if you want to just like raise your hand and then you can ask questions that way. So let me know if anybody has questions. Allowed to talk. Allowed to talk. Allowed to talk. I think everybody's allowed to talk now if you want to. or you can pop them into the chat or the Q&A box.
I'll just start by saying you're always so informative, Dana. I learned a lot.
Thanks, Benjamin.
And I have one or two questions, but I want to see if any attendees want to start.
Well, why don't you go ahead and start us off?
All right. So one is, it sounds like a CBAM is pretty much the same as a carbon tariff, except more comprehensive and flexible. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, I mean, they sort of have the same general idea is that you're trying to, in some way or another, even out the playing field, balance out the playing field so that, your domestic industries aren't at a disadvantage to sort of dirtier domestic or dirtier foreign competition. So basically the main difference is that with a carbon border adjustment, you have a domestic carbon price and you're kind of adjusting mostly for the differences in carbon prices between your country and importing countries. Whereas with a carbon tariff, you don't have to have that domestic carbon price and you can just look instead at the carbon content of your domestic stuff versus the carbon content of the importing stuff from other countries and adjust for the carbon content. So it's generally the same kind of concept that you're adjusting for those differences. And just it's whether you're adjusting for a carbon price difference or if you're adjusting for a carbon content difference.
Got it. And one question is for folks tuning in. I wonder if anyone had a little trouble joining or trouble finding the link. Just want to check on that. But it was great to see more folks join as the meeting went on. So
That's good.
not hearing anything, I assume it was okay. So
Well, everybody here found the link, so hopefully it wasn't too difficult. Does anybody else have any questions before we take off and maybe go get some dinner? Oh, Lori can't unmute. Let's see. I think. Maybe we can promote you to a panelist. Maybe that'll help. How about now, Lori? Or you can type it in if you have a question.
yeah, Lori, as a panelist, she should be able to unmute. Hmm.
I just promoted her to a panelist just now.
Well, she knows where to email you, right, Dana?
That's true. You can always email me a question if you can't get yourself unmuted and can't type it in. Won't unmute. Oh, Lori had a hard time logging in. That's unfortunate. Well, we're glad you got here. Do I have a sense of the probability of something moving forward? That's a good question. We know it's possible that the environment is kind of there for a carbon tariff to potentially move forward. Again, as I mentioned, to generate revenue as a pay for, because there could be bipartisan support. But I don't really have a good sense about the probability because the bill hasn't been reintroduced yet. I mean, it was introduced in the last session, but it didn't get a whole lot of attention. It didn't get any, like, it only had the two senators, Cassidy and Graham, as co-sponsors because there was like Senator Whitehouse has had his Democratic version, and it was just kind of a new concept to Republicans. And so I feel like if it was introduced quickly enough for congressional Republicans to digest it and see it as a way to generate revenue, they're kind of so desperate to generate revenue as a pay for tax cut extensions right now that it might get some support that way. The question is whether it would get enough support from like basically every Republican member of Congress, and I don't know. So it's a tough question to answer because it's just such a relatively new concept that we haven't heard a lot of Republicans weigh in on. And if it doesn't get into the budget reconciliation process, then it has to be that standalone bipartisan version. And then I think it would be harder to get Republicans on board because there is definitely a hesitancy among a lot of Republicans to attach their name to anything remotely related to carbon pricing. So it would be definitely a challenge, I think, for it to move forward in a bipartisan way. So I would say the conditions are relatively good for it, but if it doesn't make it into budget reconciliation, I think it'll definitely be a heavy lift. So if I had to put odds on it, I would say probably less than 50%, but yeah, it depends on the details. We just have to kind of see what's going to happen relatively soon. Lori says money talks, so there's some hope. Appreciate all the info. There's definitely some hope. It definitely could happen. But yeah, it just depends on the details of how it proceeds. Because I know right now, like they are soon going to introduce it. So yeah, we'll just have to wait and see what happens and how things evolve in the next few months.
And we could also try to influence that ourselves, right?
Yes, once the bill is introduced, I think we at CCL will probably, well, first we have to look at the new text and make sure that we like it and are able to support it. But if we do support it, then we will be mobilizing our members in all likelihood to support it, advocate it for it, and ask their members of Congress to potentially co-sponsor it. Joyce says she had trouble getting the join link to work because Zoom kept repeating its own AI self-promotion. That's not great either. Sorry to hear that, but I'm glad you made it here, Joy. All right, does anybody else have any questions before we adjourn for the night? And then we do have some more talks coming up. Lisa, maybe do you want to talk about the ones that are upcoming?
Sure. Coming up Thursday night, we have a local event for people in this area for SMUD. We'll be talking about getting to net zero. That's Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And then let me make sure I've got the right dates. The next talk after that will be climate change and your wallet, which Dana will be talking again. That's on Monday, March 31st. And the final one will be how to talk about climate change so people will listen. I will be doing that on Monday, April 7th.
Sounds good. Yeah, and the climate change in your wallet, I'm going to be talking about insurance prices, what the climate is doing to home and property and vehicle insurance and things like that. And then we're going to talk about incentives that are available to people to electrify and make their homes more efficient. We'll have someone from SMUD coming and talking about the rebates they have available. And then maybe somebody from the California Energy Commission, but we're not sure about that yet. So that'll be a good one. That'll have a lot of interesting topics, I hope. So I guess that's all the questions we got, and I'm getting hungry. I want to go make some dinner. So why don't we call it a night and hope to see everybody at some of those upcoming events.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, no problem. All right. See everybody later. Let's see.